Ahoy! Hashtag Zach here. Today I'm going to give you an update into the first week of the war in Ukraine. The first 48 hours of the war saw Russia conducting bombing and artillery bombardments across targets all over Ukraine, mostly airfields and bunkers, but also a lot of civilian targets as well, and also saw the Russians entering Ukraine with large amounts of their tanks into the countryside along the borders. If you want to know more about the first 48 hours, I definitely recommend that you watch my video on the first 48 hours of the conflict. These shock and awe tactics employed by the Russian military were very effective in the first couple days. However, as the days have gone on and turned into a week, they have definitely been reduced in their effects. Russian advances have been ground down in approaches to many of the major cities along the borders. Although this sharp decline in momentum has something to do with the fact that the first couple days were as part of a surprise attack, there's several main things the Ukrainians are doing that are really grinding down the Russian assault. One key strategic decision made by the Ukrainian military has been to pull back the vast majority of their military forces into the cities. This allows them to use the large buildings as fortresses and the narrow roads and alleys to funnel the Russian troops in where they can easily be taken out and where they cannot take full advantage of their superior firepower and weapons technology. This has been extremely effective, as many Russian troops have hardly even gotten through the suburbs of many of Ukraine's major cities that they have tried to attack. In this, the Ukrainians are actually copying some Russian tactics from World War II, where the Soviets would pull a lot of their troops into cities like Leningrad and Stalingrad and force the Germans, who had very superior tanks, to send their inferior numbers of foot soldiers into the cities and fight in very deadly battles that really ended in stalemates and, in the end, forced Germany to retreat because of their very precarious supply lines. This city defense strategy is being heavily supplemented by the hundreds of thousands of civilians taking up arms to fight for the Ukrainian government and defend their country. This is getting the president, Vladimir Zelensky, very close to his goal of growing the Ukrainian army to be in excess of 1 million men. The Ukrainian government has set up numerous points across the country where men can receive rifles and ammunition. A lot of this ammunition has come from Poland. Also, many civilians are being put to work producing Molotov cocktails, which are small, highly flammable, explosive devices that can be easily homemade and used against anything from enemy troops to enemy vehicles, or even to block their advance in some places. Another major factor in the Ukrainians' success of holding back the Russian assaults has been the import of Javelin missile systems from NATO countries. These are shoulder-launched missiles used primarily for anti-tank and other anti-vehicle purposes. The Ukrainians have used these Javelin missiles to a devastating effect, not only enacting a much higher toll on Russian tank columns, but also targeting their supply lines and fuel trucks. This has led to multiple halts of advances of Russian tank units, as they just can't advance without enough oil. While military strategy definitely has a major role to play in this war, another very important factor is the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian people, something that has been the pride of Vladimir Zelensky and has shocked Vladimir Putin, who has, until this point, assumed that the Ukrainian people were simply captive Russians. The most famous incident of this by far is the man who used himself as a physical barrier to prevent a tank from moving forward, hoping that they would stop to prevent him from being run over. Eventually, he was even kneeling in front of the tank to prevent it from advancing further. This is far from a unique story, as incidents just like this have been recorded all over the country. It may be your first instinct to think, how would that affect the war at all? Just a few people kneeling in front of tank columns and slowing them down for a few minutes? How does that change the war? Well, think about it from the Russian perspective. They're trying to organize the most massive invasion in Europe since World War II, organizing supply columns, tank convoys, fuel across a large border, and they're getting delays everywhere because normal people are just stopping tanks, and the Ukrainian military isn't even organizing it or spending any effort on it. When you add up incidents like this all over the country, it has a pretty big net result. Although the first few hours of the war saw Russian bombing and artillery strikes disabling much of the Ukrainian Air Force, many jets still survived, including this MiG-29, which has been called the Ghost of Kiev. It has spent many hours in the skies over the past week, shooting down somewhere between 7 to 10 Russian aircraft single-handedly, the only fighter pilot in European history since World War II to reach the status of being an ace fighter pilot. A horrifying and awe-inspiring event took place outside of Kharkiv, where there was a bridge that Russian tanks were preparing to cross, and a Ukrainian Marine could not get the explosives to operate effectively using the charge cables that he had laid, so he ran onto the bridge and manually detonated the explosives, preventing the Russians from crossing, but sacrificing his own life to do so. Men like this in the United States would receive medals of honor, and actions like this, when added up over the course of a war, are really what changes the tide. When analyzing the international stage, it appears at first glance that other countries are staying relatively uninvolved. However, this isn't entirely true. The United States has organized massive efforts for the NATO alliance, supplying ammunition, missiles, economic aid to Ukraine, as well as mobilizing the first ever NATO response force along Ukraine's borders and along other borders with Russia to deter Russia from taking any further actions. In addition, the United States has also politically cracked down on India and Turkey to punish them for disobeying their requests to economically isolate Russia. This has had very good effects, and now Russia is left with few allies. One of these few remaining allies is Belarus, where the government has continued to allow Russia to maintain their supply lines into their strike from the north at the capital of Kiev, but also Belarus has shocked the world by preparing for the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons. This is a stunning response to NATO's militarization on the borders with Russia and Ukraine, and implies that Russia would respond devastatingly if NATO took any action directly in Ukraine. Russia's other remaining ally is China. Many analysts around the world are deeply concerned that the current events are forcing Russia closer into a relationship with China, which could result in military and economic alliances that last a century. This has devastating consequences for Europe and the United States, as it would mean a confrontation with either of them could instantly spiral out of control into a world war. Some of these actions that China has taken to support Russia have been as direct as intensifying their trade, and even so far as to even give economic support to conduct the military campaigns. However, they've also been very indirect, in China condemning Ukraine and the United States as provoking an attack, and also China gearing up its propaganda machine and its monopoly on information within its own country to attempt to convince its people that Russia and China are against the world, fighting for the good side. The current circumstances are forcing Russia into a decision that has very negative consequences for the rest of the world, because As their invasion of Ukraine continues to be ground down to a halt, they will be faced with either one of two decisions. Either A, backing down and pulling out, which, as many people acknowledge, is very unlikely, or to continue to be aggressive in other parts of the world, such as Central Asia or the Middle East. This would lead to further alienation of Russia from the international community, but would allow it to justify itself to its own people and possibly make up wealth and resources that it has lost through being cut off from the international economy. So there you have it. Ukrainian military strategy, the triumph of the bravery of the Ukrainian people, and the alienation of Russia from the world stage. Where do you think it could go from here? Really, only time will tell. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and see you in the next video.